before I jump into the talk, I just want to mention one word that I think is very important in terms of what we're doing here, and that is the word mentorship. And we are all involved in mentoring and supporting young scientists and fellow scientists, scientists from different parts of the world. But who gets to be a mentor is just as important a question as who gets to be a scientist. And I could tell you about my mentors. I've had the incredible blessing of being mentored by people like Dr. Leakey, who started the Turkana Basin Institute, Professor E.O. Wilson at Harvard, Eleanor Ostrom as an undergraduate. But I really want to say the biggest and most important mentors I've had have been the communities that I've worked with here in Kenya and across the continent. And so people like Abdi and Ikal, who are up in northern Kenya, a member of the Rendile community, a member of the Turkana community. I think one of the things we have to do and do differently as Africans is make sure our science is truly a co-production of knowledge and recognize that we have in this continent some of the most ancient knowledge systems that have come about on the planet since humans actually come from Africa. So the other thing I'm going to say as I start to all of you, both our fellow colleagues from the continent and those from further abroad, is welcome back home. So here we are in our home in this planet. And I always tell the students, we live in the best of times. And today in the last couple of days, we've heard about those best of times. We've heard about the incredible cutting edge technology in artificial intelligence, in nanotechnology, in material science, in so many fields where people are solving problems and digging deeper into the sciences and creating solutions that we couldn't even have imagined, a few years ago. But if we look at things from a biodiversity perspective and we look at the continent, we also know that these are very challenging times. Here is a map of the world. We've seen lots of maps of the world. This is a World Hunger Index. It's actually a couple of years out of date. They changed the template, so it's now an interactive website. So it's much harder to get a single map of the world to show the hunger index. But at the time this was put together, 9 of the 10 hungriest countries in the world were in Africa, and you can see that from the map. Here's another map that I feel is very important, because this is a map that speaks to the wider question of equity and of the future of this planet and of sustainable development and energy and many other questions that we're thinking about in this meeting. This is a map showing the world in CO2 emissions from The Guardian. And you will notice Africa is the smallest. And actually, my country of Kenya is a tiny little dot there, because Africa has contributed almost nothing and continues to contribute almost nothing to climate change at a global scale, but of course is suffering from the direct impacts of climate change every day and is projected to get worse. But coming back to what I'm going to talk to you about today, our pollinators. Everybody loves pollinators. Is there anyone here who doesn't love pollinators? I don't think so. Who doesn't love bees and butterflies? And they're such wonderful creatures. And we know that around the world, everybody's concerned. They even made the cover of Time magazine a few years ago. But actually, a question, are honeybees declining in the world? Yes or no? How many would say yes? So this shows you our bias, even as scientists, well-informed people. The answer is resoundingly no. The number of honeybee colonies, which are one species that are managed, Apis mellifera, are actually increasing exponentially, because several countries around the world, China, Australia, Brazil, are mass producing honeybee colonies for export to other parts of the world, primarily Europe and the United States, where honeybees are declining. But here's an example of what is a northern, primarily Western European and American problem being projected as a global problem. Actually, within Africa, there's a huge diversity of bees and a huge diversity of pollinators, and the problems they are facing are not the same as the ones that are being faced in Europe. So sticking with that point of our biases, because I think highlighting those gaps is where we're going to explore these frontiers of knowledge, and we're going to actually answer some of these big questions and provide solutions. So this is a chart that shows you ecology and evolution papers between 1950 towards the present. And these up here are the studies that are around antagonistic interactions, nature red in tooth and claw. So it's about competition, it's about host-parasite interactions, it's about all things that involve conflict. But here are studies about cooperation, about mutualism, about species interacting with each other, species benefiting each other, species being kind to each other. And underlying this are some interesting things. One is because more research is being done in the tropics, that we're seeing that cooperation is actually much more common in nature than we previously thought. And this is being revealed by the tools we have that to better understand mutualism, to better understand these things. But a very interesting other aspect is underlying this trend. It turns out most of these papers, if not all of them, are published by white men. And most of these papers are published and are increasingly published by people, humanity in its broader sense, from around the world, and by women. And so as more diverse voices enter the sciences, we end up with a much deeper, broader, and more meaningful picture of what's happening in the world, which is critical for biodiversity. So here's some data from Google. Thank you, Google. And it shows you the trends. This is in the Google data sets of, these are published obviously in the Western lexicon of the words pollinator and honeybee. And you can see honeybee is much more common, but pollinator is taking over in recent times. So there is increasing global awareness about this. And here's some of the work that we've done looking to promote and get people to understand and connect that 1 in 3 bites of food, including the wonderful lunch that you had today, the meals you've had here in Kenya, 1 in 3 bites of food is thanks to a pollinator. So very quickly, a little safari around East Africa. This is the wonderful country of Kenya, which is home for me. I come from Western Kenya. Kenya has 56 national parks and reserves, covering 8% of the country's land area. And these mainly were set up in the colonial period, some more recently. But ironically, with 8% of the land area protected, most of the biodiversity and wildlife is not protected. Because when these areas were designed, they were designed with a very colonial Western mindset of thinking that did not think about biodiversity, did not think about culture, did not think about all these complex interactions that are part of the world. So I want you to pay attention to one particular place. This is Tsavo National Park. And this area here, the Taita Hills, it's the largest protected area in Kenya, 13,000 square miles. So what you have here is that's the Mombasa Road. This is the national park, and these are the Taita Hills, which are outside the national park. Now, the irony is, when this national park was set up, these hills, which have a community living around them, and the forests, which are very precious, were not included, because biodiversity was not even a concept when these national parks were being designed. They were being designed for big charismatic species, for hunting, for royalty. They were not designed to think about the fundamental life support systems of the planet. So ironically, in this 1 square kilometer of forest, there are more endemic species than in the entire 13,000 square miles of Tsavo National Park. So a big gap in our actual protection of these areas. One of the species that occurs there is the African violet. How many have a grandma who has African violets on her windowsill? So African violets are a plant that is widely traded across the world. They originate from the mountain forests of Kenya and Tanzania, collected by German nuns. Those nuns got up to a lot of other activities, and they collected them and took them to Europe. And you today have a $6 billion industry of this plant that is now a critically endangered species in the wild. So off I went as a student to study the pollination of this system. We were told to limit jargon. So I'm not going to talk to you about heteromorphic enantiostyle, because I'm sure that'll send people over the edge in the middle of the afternoon. But what I found was very interesting, that the same individual bees, this beautiful Amygilla bee, who pollinates this flower, basically pollinators help plants have sex. And it does this in the most kinky way you can imagine. It grabs the flower and it vibrates it at a particular frequency between 11 and 12 hertz, Only then is pollen released and the plant is pollinated. So it's critically endangered. But the key breakthrough was not seeing how kinky, plants and insects can get. It was actually finding that the same individual bees were moving between the forest and individual farms. And so that led me to working with small-scale farmers. I'm going to share a few vignettes from some of the farmers we've worked with and some of the farmers that have taught me and taught my students and that I continue to learn from. And again, to emphasize this point of that if we're going to develop science that is relevant to people, that is connected, that is really broad and deep, we must broaden who gets to be called a scientist and how that authorship and how that genesis of knowledge is done. So Domina is a wonderful farmer in Western Tanzania, actually a refugee. And Tanzania has been very gracious in giving refugees land and saying, come on, farm it, get on with it. Kenya keeps refugees in refugee camps. Other countries have other policies. But Domina grows a crop called the pigeon pea. It's a legume. This is a very arid part of Tanzania, so you have to have crops that can produce. It's a very wonderful crop because it has leaves you can eat the young pods. It's very rich in protein, in many other nutrients. And the key thing we found is that it was pollinated by two groups of bees, carpenter bees and leafcutter bees. And working with the students, we discovered that these bees, needed two crucial things, wildflowers and nesting sites. And so they're very simple that Domina manages the land in a way that is complementary to biodiversity and has very good yields. We look at another crop. This is papaya, which is in the Kerio Valley. I noticed we've been served it several times. It's very interesting because it's fully dioecious. Another jargon term, sorry, means it has separate male and female trees. So if they're separate male and female, then somebody, the hawk moth, has to go over to the male tree, collect the pollen, go to the female tree, pollinate the flowers, and that's the way you have fruit. So in this landscape, because it's managed in a very biodiverse way, traditional farming systems that are complementary, lots of trees, lots of weedy species, lots of shrubs, there is good pollination of papaya. We've been enjoying the products of that work the last couple of days. Here are mangoes. Mangoes, one of my favorites. And Peter is my former student, a mango farmer. Mango is pollinated by this incredible breadth of insects. So on a single farm where Peter lives, we have 1,000 different pollinator species pollinating mango, which is really remarkable. So one of the big challenges for us to really understand and quantify biodiversity is that basic interaction and the basic identification of all these different components of the system. One of my favorite farmers is Esther. Esther is based in Western Kenya, Kakamega Forest, near where I grew up. She's a coffee farmer. And coffee is this incredible crop. Many, many different species of insects are involved, bees and butterflies. But I want to point out two things that Esther does. Esther is very, very intimately familiar with her plants. She's able to manage her land and manage her trees in a way that is complementary to biodiversity. She has both traditional knowledge as well as new knowledge. Knowledge is not static, including in farmers, including in traditional societies. So Esther's interactions with what's around her are a critical component of how we're going to address producing, more and better coffee. Pollination in coffee produces the best coffee. Kenya has the best coffee in the world, AA rated. And that's because of the number of bees that visit the flowers. So we can go into the complex genetics behind that separately. Another important thing with Esther, and this was pointed out so eloquently yesterday by our friend from Uganda, Esther is, like many farmers, chronologically gifted. And yet in Esther's case, she is actually teaching her daughter, who's part of the system, and she's teaching me. And so another crucial part, a big gap, if you ask me to identify one of the big pictures, is that next generation of people who are users of science, not just producers of science, that the users of science, the users of knowledge, particularly in conservation, have a place at the table to understand and engage and to learn and mentor and to share what is, this wonderful, wonderful diversity of life. So here's one of my favorite bees, a carpenter bee, pollinating, this coffee. And there's 1,000 bee species in Kenya, over 20,000 in the world. Here's passion fruit. I'll just skip passion fruit very quickly because of time, but I wanted to talk about camels. Now, how is he going to connect bees with camels, you might be thinking? Well, the camel's a very interesting animal. Right now, in the middle of the drought, there are only 2 species of livestock that are still producing, the camel and the chicken. Chickens have their own agenda, but camels are very, very interesting because they are living in this very harsh ecosystem, and they're feeding on plants, mainly legumes, a few grasses, and still able to produce milk. Their microbiome, their adaptation, this is an ecosystem that gets up to over 50 degrees Celsius routinely, and they're still able to be productive. Livestock and pastoralism are one of the most ancient ways of life. We've been keeping livestock for over 30,000 years. We've only been farming for 10,000. So we still have a lot to learn from these systems about food security and about the future of the planet. And you can convert that dry, inhospitable, vegetation into nutrition using animals that have adapted to it, like the camel. But the critical component is that bees pollinate the indigofera, that is the main diet of the camel. So while for humans, 1 in 3 bites of food is thanks to a pollinator, for camels, 9 out of 10 bites of food is thanks to a pollinator. So here are some of the wonderful bees that we work with. This is up in Turkana. I've had a student helping sort through specimens over the summer. We're up to 700 species from one site. In Western Kenya, Kakamega Forest, near Esther's farm, we have 250 species. So more than double in the desert compared to a rainforest site. So the other thing with biodiversity is we mustn't assume that we know it all about the distribution of diversity, because there are certain species of plants and insects in particular that don't follow the patterns that we've all assumed to be true. And between the 2 sites, the most remarkable thing, there's only 1 species in common, and that's the honeybee, the species that we as humans have moved around and managed. I'll skip this because I really wanted to talk in the last couple of minutes I have here about the importance of sharing knowledge. So I, as was mentioned, have worked to produce a number of books that are available freely. This one is online. We've also got a Swahili translations of some of these books. It's a friend of mine put it on a platform called iCow. 1 million farmers are routinely accessing it. It stimulated a huge amount of social media, Facebook groups, which I can't stand, WhatsApp groups, which I just delete the minute they add me to them. But the fact is that because that knowledge was received in a way that people could relate to and connect with, we as scientists often don't consider that a measurement of our success. So this book has almost no citations, but you know what? I don't care, because if 1 million farmers are accessing it, that gives me a personal gratification, but more importantly, a direct impact on the way biodiversity is conserved. And I think this is not just relevant to biodiversity, but to science more broadly, that the science we're doing right now in the world is so excellent and so beautiful, but the gulf between that science and the public understanding and the problems that we face is growing bigger. And who is going to address that? The media, governments, maybe. Most importantly, we are. We as scientists are going to take charge, and we're going to engage, and we're going to say, listen to us, hear us, understand us, and we will also listen to you and hear you and understand you. And that is what is going to drive change. I'll end with a little bit of a wonderful discovery we made of a new species of bee. It turns out actually not just humans, but bees. This is one of the most ancient Gondwanan bees that it also came from northern Kenya. We went to the community and we agreed this is how we will name it. And then, as was mentioned, I've published a book on grasses. I was actually accosted yesterday in the corridors by people said, please, Dr. Dino, can you sign our book? But for me, the greatest compliment was I just received a message and someone told me, a Kenyan lady, a rural Kenyan lady said, I've replaced the Bible on my bedstand with your book on grasses. And rather than reading a Bible verse in the evening, I read one of the species description, and it lifted my heart to hear that. So thank you very much for listening to me today.